Can you hear me? They're still arriving. Yeah, okay. Okay, so looking for the presentation, we were speaking about competencies last week, right? Is that right?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. And we were, I think, around here, doctrine of implied external powers. Who remembers? No, maybe I have already described this. Ah, right, sorry. Vedete qualche lucetta accesa? Ok. Okay, let's wait a sec. And I haven't shared the screen, or have I? No, I haven't. See, that is the one. Okay. So, okay, guys, I'm asking you if you do remember which one, at what point we had arrived last week. Sorry. Implied external powers. Had we started to speak about that? Here, we stopped at this point. Okay, good. So, do you have questions for the previous part on the issue of competencies, the problems of the distribution of competencies, doubts, questions? Okay. So, what we had introduced last week is remember we said that the competencies of the union have to be explicitly conferred on the union by the treaties, so that there is a principle of conferral that is at the basis of the system of competencies, with some, I would not say exceptions, but rather some flexibilities. That is some the possibility for the institutions to exercise powers, normative powers, legislative powers, even if it is not expressly, the power is not expressly conferred, or with legal basis. You remember what the legal basis is, no? It's the provision that confers the power, with legal basis that are quite broad in their scope, like Article 114 for the internal market, which is very wide, no? And whose application has been a little bit restricted by the interpretation and also by the revisions, but remains very wide. Same thing can be said of Article 352, no? The flexibility clause, the one that allows the institutions to adopt legislation when there is no power conferred, but with a very strict procedure that entails unanimity and approval by the European Parliament and proposal by the Commission. Also, that provision has been somehow restricted, saying that the actions to be taken should be within the framework of an existing policy, although it has been used, especially in the past, also to start new policies like environment in the early 80s. But these clauses of flexibility do not change the fact that in one way or the other, the powers have to be conferred. Okay, because both Article 114 and Article 352 are written in the treaty, so they allow the adoption of measures based on that provision. What is different is using the doctrine of implied external powers that, as I told you, in international law is, again, it's the counterpart of the theory of conferral, no? Based on the interpretation, on the strict interpretation of international treaties. Remember, I told you that international law traditionally said that state obligations must be interpreted in a restrictive way, because states have to expressly agree to all limitations of sovereignty. So that's principle. The doctrine of implied powers is somehow the counterpart of this principle, because it says that in certain cases, or better, the International Court of Justice has said that in certain cases, international organizations need powers, need the possibility to exercise powers that were not expressly conferred upon them if they are necessary to exercise their functions. This is the idea of the implied external powers for international organizations under the theory expressed by the International Court of Justice. What about the EU? In the EU, as we already said, speaking of a doctrine of implied powers is not possible, because there are already procedures to expand somehow the powers of the Union, no? Article 114 and 352. So, is there any room for applying a doctrine of implied powers to the EU? The Court of Justice has found this room in the field of treaty-making power. Treaty-making power is, we can say, an expression of the external action of the Union. So the activity that the Union carries out towards the exterior, towards states that are not members, towards other international organizations. It starts from the assumption that the Union, and before the Union, the communities, the European communities, are subjects of international law, and subjects of international law have the right to assume obligations and rights in the international legal order. Well, yeah, good morning.
But it's not available.
Did you book seat?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can somehow, because, yeah, there are seats. Yeah, come on. We have open windows, open doors, so absolutely stay. So we are speaking about competencies and external competencies, saying that the Union is so that the fact that the union can enter into international agreements is part of the status of the union as a subject of international law. Now, this idea of international, of the character of the union and the communities as subjects of international law is something that has to do with the effectivity of the action of the union in international relations. And it's all the debate among scholars. The subjectivity of international organizations is a very old area of study for international law scholars. Now we can say that there is no discussion about the subjectivity of the union, and not because the treaty itself says so. The treaty says that the union is a subject, is a law subject, without specifying. So it is a subject, it's a legal person in the domestic legal orders of the member states, where of course it can stay, it has legal standing before courts, it can act as a legal person. And it is a legal person also in international law. This is widely accepted. There is no discussion about that. And how can we affirm this? I repeat, not because it is written in the treaties, but because the European Union has for decades now entered, concluded, negotiated international agreements with other countries. And the other countries have never objected to the, to the right of the European Union to do that, no? To negotiate in the name of the union, to conclude, to ratify international agreements. It has been accepted by the rest of the international community, and that's the principle of effectivity in international law. So it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what you do. And it matters if the others accept you as a subject. Okay, this is the same also with states. States exist insofar as they have effective control on the portion of territory that they that is within the borders, if they have effective power of government on the population, and if they are active in international relations. And so, in this sense, even if no formal recognition of the status of subject of international law is required, either for states or for international organizations. What matters is if these subjects actually have, a position in the international community, and the European Union does so, and has for decades, from the very beginning, we can say. And the treaty-making power is which is the power to enter into international agreements, has a double level, we can say. Okay, there is the external level of the treaty-making power and the internal one. As for the external level, is what we just said. So the union, and before the union, the communities are recognized, widely recognized subjects of international law, so they can enter into international agreements. They are recognized as partners in international agreements, which means that as a subject towards the exterior, there is the distinction of competencies, the distribution of competencies that we are studying now between union and member states makes no sense. The external partner who is negotiating with the union does not know how the internal competencies are divided between the union and member states. It accepts the union as a subject, as a partner, as a negotiating partner. It negotiates, concludes the agreement. What I mean is that the third party does not know and does not care about, the internal competencies of the union. What a third party cares about is as we said, the subjectivity of the union and its titularity, its entitlement to enter into international agreements, which is established. Okay. So in order to understand whether, according to the EU legal order, the Union is really entitled to enter into a certain international agreement, we have to look at the treaties and what the treaties said, okay, which will later be projected outside. And the treaty also in this area evolved from the first drafts, where there were only two possibilities of international agreements, which were trade and association agreements. So association agreements, which were, we can say, basically of two kinds in the beginning. Association agreements with former colonies. Don't forget that at the end of the 50s, the process of decolonization was starting. And don't forget that also in the Schuman Declaration, if you remember, there was a reference to Africa, no? That the development of Africa was one of the priorities of the new integration that was starting. So the treaty mentions association agreements as special kinds of agreements that have the objective of bringing developing countries, newly independent countries, closer to the communities with a closer cooperation, also based on a common institutional framework. And the second area where the association agreements have been used is in the process of accession of new members. Again, in this area, often, I would say always, the accession was preceded by an association agreement, so that the state started to closely cooperate with the communities and establishing common institutions and getting somehow used to being part of this cooperation. So there have been association agreements with candidate countries. And this is one. The second area is trade. Again, it was easy to imagine at the moment of drafting the treaties that trade would become a major area of activity for the new communities, because the communities were building a common market with a customs union, which means that the external tariffs were to be unified. And this meant that customs union also needed, again, an external projection. So the possibility for the communities to negotiate tariffs and trade relations also with third countries, because otherwise it would be very complicated to coordinate the individual negotiations of the member states in the field of trade with the establishment of a common, external barrier. This is very practical, I would say. And this is also why the court immediately said that after the completion of the customs union, trade was to become an exclusive power of the communities. So excluding the participation of the member states in the negotiations and conclusion of international trade agreements. So apart from these two sectors, trade and association agreements, there was nothing else about treaty-making power. There was just a procedure, the description of a procedure that started saying that it is what currently is Article 218 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union. At that time, it had a different number. So this article said that whenever the community, whenever the treaties provide for the I don't remember exactly, but there was a reference to the fact that the treaty had to provide for the competence to enter into an agreement. So it said whenever the treaty says that the community can enter into an agreement, this is the procedure to be followed. So how was this interpreted? At first it was interpreted that basically the communities, in order to be able to negotiate an agreement, needed that the relative power be written in the treaties. So basically at the beginning, it was only trade and association agreements. Okay, in all other sectors, it was not written there, so there was no power. And here is where the Court of Justice started intervening. And the first case is the ERTA case, which is this one. It is a case that was decided in 1971, case number 2270. And this entailed a teleological interpretation of treaty norms on the transport policy. So you remember teleological interpretation, we already mentioned that. It is a technique of interpretation that is based not only on the literal meaning of the norms that you are interpreting, but also on the objective, on the aim of the norm, so of the finality that the norm pursues, on the goal that it wants to achieve. So, and the idea of the theory of useful effect, or effet utile in the French expression that the court uses, is precisely that. So the interpretation of the norm must have a useful effect in the activity of the institutions. So it must be useful for the achievement of the goals. And in this case, in the ERTA case, the court tried to do this. It was the case of the European Road Transport Agreement negotiated in the Economic Commission for Europe of the United Nations. So with the participation of many other European countries, and the member states, 6 at that time, had discussed in an informal meeting some common guidelines to carry out together jointly these negotiations. Why did they feel the need to coordinate? Well, because transport and road transport is one of the policies of the communities. So the communities had and still have the power to regulate transport internally. And in addition to that, 2 regulations had already been adopted regulating road transport, so the same field that was being regulated through the agreement. So there was possible conflict between the regulations and the treaty and the agreement. And this is why there was the need for a coordination. And what happened? It happened that the Commission brought action to the Court of Justice against this deliberation of the member states, saying that it was not a deliberation of the member states meeting informally outside of the institutions of the communities, but in reality it was a decision of the Council. So that the substance of that act was different from the form. Okay, and that act, that deliberation of the member states was infringing, impacting the competencies of the Commission. and that was the Commission, the subject that, as representative of the communities, had to negotiate that agreement. Because since the adoption of those regulations, the community had exercised those powers and had subtracted the corresponding competence to the member states. So this was the idea of the Commission. Basically, the fact that there is nowhere in the chapter on transport policy, there's nowhere written that there wasn't written that the communities could enter into international agreement on that subject. So according to a literal interpretation of the norm on the procedure, whenever the treaty establishes the possibility to enter into international agreement, there was no competence because it was not written. So what the court says here is that it was looking for sort of expanded reading of the norm. So looking for an implied power that is based on the existing powers. So is it demonstrated, is it evident that the communities do have a competence in the field of road transport? Yes, they do, because they have already exercised that. They have regulated internally road transport. So the competence exists. It is only an internal competence, though. So to that internal competence does correspond an external one or not? So this was the question. And also the second question was, if yes, so if there is an external, a corresponding external competence, does it preclude the member states to exercise it independently from the communities, or does it become an exclusive competence of the communities? To these questions, the court answered saying that, and this is the basis of the parallel competencies, saying that basically the communities do have a potential external competence, so treaty making power, potential in all the areas that are subject to internal powers, okay? In all areas for which the communities have an internal competence, they have a corresponding potential external one, or a treaty making power. Basically, the court says that, and it bases this consideration precisely on what I was saying before, and that it is that the communities are subjects of international law, and so they do have the external power. They must have it because it is intrinsic, inherent in the status of subjects of international law. So towards the exterior, the union and before the communities have power, have treaty making power for all the areas that are for which it has internal power without distinction. The distribution between the union and the member states is merely internal, and it has to be determined according to the rules that the court applies, which are the following. So there is a potential external competence that extends to all the areas where the communities have competence. This potential competence becomes effective in the moment where, apart from the cases of exclusive powers like trade, of course, in all other cases, but trade is also expressly conferred, so it's not a problem. In all other cases, the union, the communities acquire the effective power of entering into international agreements whenever the internal competence has been exercised, creating a possible conflict with international obligations. And this is what the court says, that after the adoption of internal measures, the treaty power becomes exclusive due to the effect of preemption, which happens when the agreement is likely to affect existing common rules or alter their scope. So whenever there is the possibility, must not be an actual conflict, but the possibility of a conflict, because the agreement is likely to affect existing common rules or alter their scope. So whenever this happens, so whenever there is an internal exercise of competence, immediately the union acquires a corresponding external exclusive competence for the effect of preemption. Preemption, supremacy of EU law over national law, even at international level. So, and what has the useful effect have to do with all this? Well, it's simple. You have to interpret the norms in a way that they do have a useful effect in the exercise of the internal competencies. If you deny the competence of the union to enter into international agreements, if you deny the treaty-making power of the union in the cases where, like this, there can be a conflict between internal rules and external obligations, of course, the interpretation of the, in this case, transport policy is not useful, because it goes directly into a possible conflict between internal and external rules. So what is the useful interpretation of that norms? The useful interpretation is that it is the community that has to enter into that agreement, because otherwise it would create a conflict, overlap of regulations that might also lead to international controversies. Well, the ERTA case actually didn't finish well for the Commission because, despite establishing this principle, the court said that in the end, the deliberation was not illegal because the regulations had been adopted pending the negotiations. So it found pretexts not to apply the principle. And it is not the first time that the court basically establishes a revolutionary, if you want, principle, but then it stops, and saves the case at hand, and it applies it later in order to help the institutions and member states digest the principle. The same happened with the Costa versus Enel case, with supremacy, and where the court established the principle of supremacy, but then it saved the law that was at stake in that case because, of considerations in the merit. So, in the ERTA case, the trigger for the establishment of an exclusive power for the union, for the communities, was the exercise of the internal competencies and the possible conflict or potential conflict that might arise between the internal and external rules. Then there are other cases where the court further expanded the external powers of the union and the exclusive external powers of the union. And then one of the most important is this one, Opinion 176 of 1977, on a laying up fund for vessels in the Rhine and Moselle fluvial basins. So what is the case here? That there is river navigation in many European rivers. This is one of the river basins where there is the huge traffic of vessels, of commercial vessels, and there was the need to regulate this. Again, we are in the field of transport policy. There was the need to regulate this, and this affected a number of states that had where this river basins activity impacted. But there was a problem. The problem was that Switzerland, a non-member state, was also active in that river basin with a large number of vessels. So the problem was how to regulate navigation there through internal rules without involving Switzerland, or how to involve Switzerland anyway. And the idea was precisely the conclusion of international agreement, which was the object of the opinion requested to the Court of Justice. And the opinion, again, asked whether the communities had the power to enter into an international agreement, which power was not provided in the treaties. And in a case where the internal competence had not been exercised yet, because we didn't fall within the scope of the ERTA case, there was no internal rule about the internal navigation. So, but it was necessary to involve a third country, because otherwise, again, the internal regulation would not produce any useful effect. So we are at the same point, useful effect. Here, the useful effect was the joint exercise of the competence, because without Switzerland, no effective regulation of that activity would be achieved. And this is what the court said. The court said that, again, the treaty-making power in fields where the involvement of a third country is necessary for the effective and useful exercise of the internal corresponding competence is an exclusive power of the communities. So the communities have the exclusive power to enter into an international agreement that allows the community to usefully exercise an internal competence. Okay. Clear problems. So you see the difference between the two possibilities. The first one is when there already is an internal regulation, and in that case, the problem is whether the agreement, the external agreement, may have an impact on the internal regulation, creating a conflict. But even without creating a conflict, there is, in any case, a possible overlap. And in that case, it is the union that has to conclude the agreement. The second case is where the involvement of the third countries is necessary in order to usefully exercise the internal competence. And this is the case of the navigation on the Rhine and Moselle. Now, let's go to the beginning of all this chapter, and let's look at what happened with the Lisbon Treaty. Remember that we said that the better definition of the distribution of competencies between the Union and the member states was one of the areas where the conference had to make a simplification, to achieve a simplification, a clarification. I told you at the beginning of this chapter on competencies that the system of distribution of competencies was, and in part still is, one of the most complicated structures in EU law. So it was necessary to simplify it and to clarify, to make it more easy to understand for the citizens, for all those who are interested in knowing who does what in the European Union. And if you want to have, if an undertaking, a foreign country, an international organization wants to have relations with the European Union or the member states, it is necessary to understand, who does what. So the conference, and before the conference, the constitutional treaty, decided to codify all the system of competencies. And this codification of the system of competencies derives from the case law of the Court of Justice, okay? Especially in this field, but not only in this field of external action. So the codification is of the external action of the treaty making power is twofold. So there are two provisions on codification. One is this one that we're reading now, Article 216 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, which establishes all the cases where the Union is entitled to enter into international agreements according to the parallelism of competencies and all the criteria for applying the parallelism of competencies. The other one is in Article, I think 2, I don't remember, the one on the exclusive competencies, where we can say you find the codification of the case law of the Court of Justice on exclusive internal powers. If you compare the two, you see that there is little difference. The other one is a little bit more, I can say, stricter than this one, because it establishes an external exclusive power. But really, I don't want you to go into the subtleties. I just want you to understand the general criteria for the establishment of the treaty-making power of the Union. So, which is now, I can say, basically unlimited. So we can say, generally speaking, then we will see that the criteria. But generally speaking, we can say that the European Union now has a general treaty-making power in all the areas, the fields that are object of its internal powers. So we can safely say that there is a complete projection of the Union to the exterior in all areas of its action. So let's read Article 216. The Union may conclude an agreement with one or more third countries or international organizations where the treaties so provide, or where the conclusion of an agreement is necessary in order to achieve, within the framework of the Union's policies, one of the objectives referred to in the treaties, or is provided for in a legally binding Union Act, or is likely to affect common rules or alter their scope. Okay, let's see the cases where the treaties so provide. Okay, so when you find in the treaties, in one of the policies, the possibility to enter into agreements, there's not a problem, and the institutions can do that. And we can say that now there is a way larger number of cases where it is expressly stated that the Union can enter into agreements or can establish cooperation with third countries. So we have many more express, attribution of external competence than the two originally present in the treaty. Then this is the second one, is the opinion 176 case, where the conclusion of an agreement is necessary in order to achieve within the framework of the union's policies one of the objectives referred to in the treaties. And this we can say is the wider one, because I think the institutions may easily convince the court that a certain agreement was necessary to achieve one of the objectives of the treaties, provided that the agreement falls within one of the policies of the union. And the third one, the third case is provided for in a legally binding union act. This is also in the ERTA case. This was another option in the ERTA case, where, because sometimes it happens that regulations, EU regulations, provide the possibility of implementation through external agreements. So in that case, of course, there is an attribution of competence, or is likely to affect common rules or alter their scope. And this is the codification of the ERTA case on the previous exercise of the internal competence that carries, with itself also the corresponding external one. Okay, clear? Okay, so it is very nice and interesting if you know this and you understand how it evolved and how the union arrived to this point. But really what is the most important thing to say is that the union now has this practically complete projection of its action on the external plane. So with the possibility of entering into international agreements in all areas that are object of its internal competence. What is important to know, though, and the only reason why the distinction between this provision, the subtle distinction between this provision and the one that we find that we will see on the exclusive powers is important, is because in the case of an exclusive external power, the union can conclude the agreement alone. So the party would be the European Union and the third party concerned. While in the case of a non-exclusive external power, the parties will be the union and its member states. So here the things get really complicated, and this codification does not help very much. Also because there are many agreements now. If we have time to give a look at the trade policy of the union, you will see, if you look just at the summary, the table of content of one of those agreements, of the most recent ones, of trade and cooperation, comprehensive trade agreements, and so on. You see that they touch upon a lot of areas of cooperation. Some of them are exclusive of the union, some of them are not, some of them are exclusive of the member states. So there is a very complicated distribution of competencies in the agreements. Okay, and the Court of Justice has tried to unify somehow, especially under the trade policy, including in the trade policy a lot of, how can we say, auxiliary areas based on the fact, for example, that now the external action has a joint set of principles and objectives. And to make an example, among these objectives, there is sustainable development. So the court has adopted a wide notion of sustainable development and said that within this notion, that is one of the objectives also of the trade policy, many things could be included. For example, protection of workers' rights, social rights, and protection of the environment, and some things also prohibition of forced labor, child labor, all these kind of things that impact on trade, of course, but are something, if you want, distinct. But the court has included all this in the notion of, trade policy. So from certain perspective, it expands the notion of exclusive powers, but cannot expand to everything. So something remains outside of the exclusive power and requires the participation of the member states. And these agreements with wide scope that touch upon competencies that are exclusive, shared, and exclusive of the member states are called mixed agreements. Mixed. In these mixed agreements, you find one of the parties, which is the European Union and its member states, and the other party, which is the third country concerned. So basically, the European Union and the member states are a single party. I don't know if it's clear. So it is not a multilateral agreement, it is a bilateral agreement, but where one of the parties is composed of 28. So the 27 member states plus the European Union, all of which have to ratify the agreement in order to allow its entry into force. So you understand that when the Union has to conclude an agreement in the form of a mixed agreement, the procedure is really, really long, because not only you have negotiations are carried out normally by the Commission, also in the name of the member states. But in the cases of mixed agreements, the Commission has to acquire the unanimity of the member states in order to bring the position, the negotiation position to the other contracting party. Okay, so things become longer, discussions, unanimity discussions. It's not the Commission that decides anymore, but it has behind it, elaborated discussions. And this is one. And the other thing is that once the treaty is signed, so we have the text, the final text cannot be applied until all the member states have ratified it, which often entails the adoption of decisions by the national parliaments. And that can take months or years in some cases. And this is why normally this kind of important comprehensive agreements are applied provisionally, which is of course often necessary, because if you have a big free trade agreement, for example, you want to start dismantling trade barriers as soon as possible, because that's important for the economy, it's important for the operators and so on. But you have a provisional application that is not complete legally, pending ratifications, with ratification that sometimes are controversial, because sometimes there are categories that think that they will be harmed by the agreement. There are protests. You just think of the famous agreement, free trade agreement with Canada, that was contested. Okay, and there are often delayed ratifications. So the final entry into force, which legally, is the moment where really the agreement can produce legal effects, is delayed in the case of mixed agreements. And that is why the Commission always tries to bring the agreements under the exclusive power of the Union. And this is why the Commission keeps bringing the agreements to the Court of Justice for the opinion, searching for the umbrella of the exclusive power of the union, not always successfully, we must say, like, for example, in the case of the agreement with Singapore, I think, yes, where the court said that there was this expansion that I mentioned before on the part of sustainability, right? So the trade policy can include, some protection of human rights and some part of environmental protection. But at the same time, it did not include the rules for the dispute settlement between investors and states, another highly controversial field of cooperation for the union and the member states. So these big agreements that also affect this kind of aspects, because that the trade policy now also involves the treatment of foreign direct investments. No, you know what we are talking about. Foreign direct investment is an important field in the economic international relations. But foreign direct investments not only include, the treatment of the investors by the countries and the involvement of the national state of the investors, rules of conduct for the investors and all this stuff. But there is also the problem of dispute settlement in the case of a controversy that can arise by measures adopted by the state of, nationalization, expropriation, a limitation of the right of the investor to expatriate the revenues of the investment, and so on. You are students of economics, so you know much more than I do of these things. But what I do know from the legal point of view is that this kind of disputes tend now to be solved not by the national courts of the states involved, but mostly by sort of international tribunals, where the parties to the dispute are the state and the investor. Okay, this is not a new thing, but it has become more frequent to find clauses of this kind in international agreements on investments. So the European Union acquired with Lisbon competence in negotiating agreements on investment, on foreign direct investments, which is good because previously member states had, a network of agreements with third countries on foreign direct investment that were different from one another, so they were not coordinated. So it is good that now it is the union that negotiates on that, and it is good also because being the investments is not so much different from other areas of the market. No, if the union has an internal market with free movement of goods, of people, and so on, services, it is logic somehow, it is consequential that also foreign investments should be regulated with same criteria, with same principles. So it makes sense to have foreign direct investment within the scope of the trade policy. But some of the consequences of direct investments, like dispute settlement, state investor dispute settlement, remains outside of this scope. So it has to be regulated jointly by the union and the member states, because it involves directly the capacity of the member states to, to establish a tribunal, to be in this arbitration system. Okay, so this for the mixed agreements and the parallelism of competencies. Do you have questions? No questions? Are you sure? Okay, if you say so. Okay, and now we have here, I think that we will be very fast because basically we already know what we are talking about here. And again, we have a codification of many of the things we said so far. We have a codification in the treaty that has the objective, as we said, of simplifying the system of competencies, giving different categories of competencies that derive from the case law of the Court of Justice that has, worked on this and adopted decision on this for decades. So the first category of competencies is the exclusive competencies. This we can say is a closed list of fields where the union has an exclusive power, and there is a definition. Article 2, paragraph 1. When the treaties confer on the union exclusive competence in a specific area, only the union may legislate and adopt legally binding acts, the member states being able to do so themselves only if so empowered by the union or for the implementation of union acts. Sorry, just sip of tea. Okay, so what we have here is the definition of the exclusive power of the union. It is the case where only the union has the power to adopt legally binding acts and legislation. Okay, the member states lose their power in these fields, and they can legislate only if the union authorizes them, or if there is the need to adopt implementing acts on the basis of union acts, of course. So, and this, as we will see, is a closed list because these are the so-called exclusive powers, those competencies that are exclusive by definition, that are by nature, okay, that they are always exclusive. So it doesn't matter whether the union exercises these powers or not, they remain exclusive of the union. So if the union does not exercise them, no one exercises them. So the member states cannot, in any case, exercise those powers. And they are a customs union, establishment of the competition rules necessary for the functioning of the internal market, monetary policy for the member states whose currency is the euro, conservation of marine biological resources, and common commercial policy. And they remain these. So to add another exclusive competence by nature, there would be the need to modify the treaty. I don't think even the Court of Justice could do that at this point, and this is one of the reasons why I said at the beginning that the only critical point in this codification of the system of competencies is that it somehow blocks or freezes the possibility of the court to further interpret the system of competencies, at least in certain areas like this one, where you have a closed list and it would be probably impossible for the court to say that other competencies become exclusive by nature. So customs union, we know the establishment of the free movement, of the internal free movement of goods and the external common tariff with its external projection, which is the common commercial policy. Then the conservation of marine biological resources. This also derives from case law of the Court of Justice, based on the, where it was about migratory species of fish and the participation of the communities in organizations of marine biological resources conservation. And the court said that since the biological resources do not know, borders, not respect state borders, and have to be protected in national territorial waters, but also on the high seas. And with the participation in international organizations, it is necessary that it is the communities that act in substitution of the member states. Then the monetary policy for the member states whose currency is the euro, which is policy that is entrusted to the European Central Bank and to the system of central banks. Then the competition rules necessary for the function of the internal market. This is another interesting area. We will study something of the competition policy. But here, what regards the distribution of powers, the common rules for competition policies are those we find in the treaties that are valid for all the member states. Then, of course, the competition policy has to be implemented, and it is implemented at the two levels. So at the EU level, with an exclusive power to establish the competition rules necessary for the functioning of the internal market, which means that it applies to all behaviors of undertakings that may affect the internal market. Then, of course, the member states have their own system of competition rules, no? That has to be consistent with the European rules, and that regulate competition inside the state. But of course, competition inside the state also impacts on the internal market, although at first indirectly. I don't know if you have followed the discussions here in Italy about the new competition rules that have been recently passed by the government, and they will have to be approved by Parliament. And the discussion was precisely about this, so about the consistency or inconsistency, according to some observers, and possibly also for the Commission that is starting to be concerned, of some of the Italian rules with the general European ones. No, the classic thing is about beaches, no, the concession of use of public spaces like beaches to private subjects for tourism. No, this is the idea. They should be open to all possible investors from all over Europe. That's part of the free movement of services. No, but they are really, can we say, well established in Italy, and it is a very difficult thing to change that one. So you see how these rules that are being adopted at national level on beaches, for example, may impact on competition at the European level, because they might, prevent European investors, service providers to make use of opportunities of investment on Italian beaches. This is just one of the examples that I make because it is something that is really very much discussed here in Italy, or at least at the government and political level. Okay. Then we have paragraph 2 of Article 3, which adds to the closed list of sectors that are exclusive competence of the Union, the exclusive external competencies that you have to read in conjunction with Article 216 if you want to try to find the differences, like those games when you have two drawings that are very similar and the game is find the difference. Then you can make the same thing here. So when does the EU have an exclusive external competence? One, when the conclusion of an agreement is provided for in a legislative act of the Union. B, when it is necessary to enable the Union to exercise its internal competence. And 3, insofar as the conclusion of the agreement by member states may affect common rules or alter their scope. You have here the 3 references, jurisprudential references that are not, of course, present in the text of the treaty. And you can play here the game and see the difference with Article 216, understand why this is stricter than the other one. Okay, we don't have time for this. Although, as I told you, it's important because it could make the difference between an exclusive and EU-only agreement and a mixed agreement. When you will be members of the legal service of the Commission, you will need to know very well these subtleties. Sorry. Shared competencies. The shared competencies are the bulk. The largest number of EU competencies are shared, which means that they can be, in principle, can be exercised by either by the Union or by the member states. Article 2, paragraph 2, definition. When the treaties confer on the Union a competence shared with the member states in a specific area, the Union and the member states may legislate and adopt legally binding acts in that area. The member states shall exercise their competence to the extent that the Union has not exercised its competence. The member states shall again exercise their competence to the extent that the Union has decided to cease exercising its competence. Clear? No, not very clear, right? Needs some explanation. So, the beginning is clear. When the treaties confer on the Union a competence shared with the member states in a specific area, the Union and the member states may legislate and adopt legally binding acts in that area. So they both have the competence. The problem is how to regulate the reciprocal cases of exercise of the competence. So what happens is that once the Union has exercised that competence with the adoption of legally binding acts, again, as we said before regarding the treaty making power, the Union has occupied that field, that portion of the field. Preemption, that's the principle, preemption or occupation of the field. You imagine a large football field for each one of the policies of the Union. Whenever the Union adopts an act regulating a part of that field, it occupies that part of the field. And when that field, that part of the field is occupied, the member states cannot act on that anymore. They lose the power. This is a competence that becomes exclusive by exercise. And what is the difference with the previous ones? Well, for one, the difference is that up to the moment where the Union exercises the competence, the member states retain their own competence. Okay? Once the Union has exercised, they lose it, but the Union can change its mind, so decide that from a certain point on, there's not the need anymore to exercise that competence, and the states can can get their competence back. Okay, so there's more, it's more dynamic in this case, and it's less impactful on the sovereignty of the member states, because these competencies, shared competencies, evolve over time. So the union can exercise them, then can not exercise them anymore, and the member states regain the same the competence, and this is a continuous evolution. And this is the largest number, so we can say that this is the default category of competencies. Most of them are shared, with exception of the few exclusive and of the few support competencies that we are going to see. In fact, in the they are the ordinary competencies. There is a list in the article that I have not here, and the list is open, not closed, as is the list of the exclusive powers. They can be described as a divided field. The member states are allowed to legislate only in the part of the field that is not occupied by EU legislation, preemptive effect of EU legislation, or preemption or occupation of the field. Then there are a few parallel competencies. Basically, there are two: research, technological development and space, development cooperation, and humanitarian aid, that are parallel. What does this mean? You do not have to confuse this with the external parallelism. These are parallel competencies because basically they are shared competencies like the others, but they do not produce the preemption effect. So in this case, both the union as a subject and the member states as other subjects can have their own research, technological development and space policy, and their own development cooperation policy and humanitarian aid policy. Why? Because there is not the risk of, how can we say, of conflict between the two, provided that, of course, there is some sort of coordination of coherence between the policies of the states and the policies of the union. For example, that in the cooperation policy, the union adopts sanctions while the member states adopt closer cooperation with the same country. That would be weird. But apart from that, and that is in the field of coherence of the external action, which tries at least to be coordinated by the foreign ministers of the member states. For the rest, there is no need of significant overlaps. And at the same time, it allows union and member states to accumulate the investments in these fields of action. So it could be even a benefit for those involved. Then there is the third category, which is competencies to support, coordinate, or supplement, or complementary competencies. And this is Article 2, Paragraph 5 of the Treaty on the Functioning. Let's read. In certain areas and under the conditions laid down in the treaties, the Union shall have the competence to carry out actions to support, coordinate, or supplement the actions of the member states, without thereby superseding their competence in these areas. Legally binding acts of the Union adopted on the basis of the provisions of the treaties relating to these areas shall not entail harmonization of member states' laws or regulations. What does it say here? Basically, that the competencies that the Union has in these fields do not change the fact that how can we say, the affected competencies are pertain to the member states. So here we are talking about member states' competencies where the union has the power to coordinate, to support, to supplement. Okay, so to give a plus of, you know, I don't want to say help, but of improvement of the policies. And if you look of which they are, you understand health, industry, culture, tourism, education, youth and sport, civil protection, administrative cooperation. These are the fields where the union may have put in place actions, programs of coordination of support to the action of the member states. The first one, which is health, has been, we can say, stressed during the pandemic to its capacity, we can say, because it's a quite limited power that the union has in the field of health, as well as in the others. You know, education, youth, and sport, they are those competencies to establish programs like the Erasmus and others for exchanges, alliances of universities like Civis that we are part of as Sapienza, and so on. So coordinate, organize exchanges of views on how to organize education, all this stuff, but the relative competence remains with the member states. The same is true with health. But when a situation like a pandemic hit the world and very hard Europe, we saw how these health powers of coordination of the European Union were limited in the possibility of a strong intervention on a transnational, we can say, health crisis. So this is why in Next Generation EU, the project of Next Generation EU that is starting, there is also strong commitment for a health union. So for reinforcing the coordination powers of the union faced to a crisis like a pandemic. Okay, so without impacting on the national powers of the member states on health, because of course, that's something that is within the powers of the states, increasing the coordination intervention powers of the union would be really necessary for the future. Then we have a couple of groups, we can say, not categories anymore, groups of areas of action of the European Union where the negotiators of the Constitutional Treaty and of the Lisbon Treaty were not able to find an agreement on within which one of the previously analyzed categories those areas could fit, and so they decided to introduce different, as I said, groups of areas of cooperation, coordinating competencies. This is quite general definition in Article 5. So they are competencies that fall outside of the main categories, and they are economic policy, employment policy, and social policy. What are these three areas that, as you see, are very important for the general, functioning of the market, but also for the member states, for the sovereignty of the member states? These are policies of the member states. So these policies remain within the, I would say, exclusive competence of the member states. It's maybe too much, but it's, I don't think it's wrong to say that. So they're within the exclusive competence of the member states. But in order to have a functioning internal market and also functioning monetary union, because let's not forget that, these areas must be closely coordinated. And this close coordination is established by the treaties and by other instruments of the institutions through processes of coordinations of, for example, of the budget of the member states for the economic policy, of the policies for favoring full employment, of the social policies, like, for example, maybe we mentioned that already, I don't remember, the directive that the directive that is in the stage of adoption about minimum wage in the European Union, and other, interventions in the field of social policy that aim at coordinating social protection, employment policies, and also economic policies at union level. These take place following the procedures that you find in the treaties, and also the procedures of the European semester. Have you heard about that? The European semester is a semester that starts in autumn and follows 6 months, about where this coordination takes place, where there is an exchange of reports of the member states. The institutions work to discuss reforms and interventions that can be made. Of course, this year everything is quite different because the European semester is somehow replaced or works jointly, goes on jointly with the approval of the national plans for the recovery plan, for the application of the Next Generation EU and accession to the funds for the recovery after the pandemic. So there is quite, different procedure going on, but the sense is the same, because the institutions monitor the adoption by the member states of those interventions of reform of these in these fields that are necessary in order to put the state in the best condition for implementing the plan for recovery. And then there are the areas of cooperation. Which are the areas of cooperation? Basically, they are the intergovernmental fields of cooperation. So the common foreign security policy and the defense policy, the common defense policy, and all those fields that are subject to intergovernmental cooperation. So that where the member states decided to be clear in not including them in any of the categories of competencies of the union, but where there is just a cooperation. Let's read Article 2, paragraph 4. The union shall have competence in accordance with the provisions of the Treaty on European Union to define and implement a common foreign and security policy, including the progressive framing of a common defense policy. Okay, so this is quite ambiguous because it says that it will be a union policy, and it is actually, but it is based on the method of intergovernmental cooperation. So where, as we said, the main actors are the intergovernmental institutions, European Council and Council, acting normally by unanimity vote and without involvement of the supranational institutions, especially the Parliament, the Commission, and the Court of Justice. So these are areas of cooperation that, of course, refer to the union as the subject that puts in place actions in that field. Like, for example, when you have a statement in the face of a crisis, decided by the common foreign security policy, that statement will be of the Union. The Union can enter into agreements in the common foreign security policy. Okay, and these will be agreements of the Union. The Union can establish missions of peace building, for example, and they will be missions of the Union, but they are decided and undertaken according to intergovernmental cooperation method and not an integration or community method as the others. So legally speaking, there is a difference between the two. Okay. At this point, we introduce rapidly the principles for the exercise of competencies. You remember at the beginning I said that there are two problems in the definition of the structure of the system of competencies in the Union. The first problem was the existence of the competence, and we covered all that in these two classes last week and today. And the second problem is the exercise of the competence. So once the existence of the competence has been established according to the rules that we described, there is the need to decide whether the Union may exercise that competence. And the two rules on this problem are the principles of subsidiarity and the principle of proportionality. You find in Article 5 of the Treaty on the European Union. Let's read. Under the principle of subsidiarity, in areas which do not fall within its exclusive competence, the Union shall act only if and insofar as the objectives of the proposed action cannot be sufficiently achieved by the member states, either at central level or at regional and local level, but can rather, by reason of the scale or effects of the proposed action, be better achieved at Union level. Okay, so this is the codification, if you want, again, codification of a principle of that you find in the beginning of the treaties, where it says that the treaties, the Union is based on the transparency, the decision making of the Union is based on transparency and on the decisions that are taken as close as possible to the citizens. So you have to look for the level, for the lowest level for decision making. So decisions have to be taken as close as possible to the citizens. If there is the possibility to achieve an objective, adopting local decisions, that would be better, or regional decisions, or national decisions. And the European Union level should be the subsidiary level. So intervene only when the other levels are incapable of achieving the objective. Or there is this, so the tests are two. The first one is the national insufficiency test. So the first test, you have to establish that it is insufficient, so that the member states, either at national or local level, they are unable to achieve the objective. And in that case, the European Union may act. But the second test is the comparative efficiency test. So here, there is the possibility that even if theoretically the member states would be able to achieve the objective, the Commission that makes the legislative proposal, the Commission may still carry out a comparative efficiency test. So see whether the sufficiency of the member states could not be, if in any case the European Union could better achieve the objectives. So yes, the member states are able, but an intervention at the European Union level is better, has a better effect on the objectives. So the Commission that has to justify the proposal under the principle of subsidiarity and explain why the member states cannot achieve the objectives or the European Union cannot achieve them better, okay, because otherwise it could be subject to judicial review by the Court of Justice. So the subsidiarity, you find a lot of comments in your book about the subsidiarity principle as a legal or political principle, which is quite, complicated, I would say, to define. In any case, since it had not achieved a lot of success, especially with the Court of Justice, which has almost never annulled an act because it violated the principle of subsidiarity. So saying that, because, as in other cases where, how can I say, so far we have discussed of the problem of competencies in terms of existence and non-existence of the competence. So the consequence of the non-existence of the competence is that in the case that the Union adopts legislation in a field that is outside of its competence, that act is invalid, okay? So there is no competence, so the act is invalid. We will study Article 263 on the action, on the judicial review of the legality of the legislation, of the acts of the Union, and the first ground for annulment is lack of competence. So if there is no competence, there is no act. That is absolutely logic. And the court has annulled acts for lack of competence. But also the violation of the principle of subsidiarity in some ways is a lack of competence. But here, the Court of Justice is much more flexible, precisely for the difficulty of a strictly legal application of the principle of subsidiarity. So, since, as we said, the distribution of competence, a clearer and simplified distribution of competencies between the Union and the states was one of the important issues to be determined with the Lisbon Treaty. Another thing that was also important for the member states negotiating this treaty was a more, we can say, effective application of the principle of subsidiarity in order to avoid the European Union over legislating, even in cases where it was not necessary. Okay. So how to reinforce the principle of subsidiarity? And they adopted protocol number 2 attached to the Lisbon Treaty that creates sort of additional procedure for the adoption of legislation that is aimed at the reinforcement of the principles of subsidiarity and also of proportionality. I see that you have really strange eyes like zombies at this point. So I think that we will study the protocol tomorrow. And the next chapter is on fundamental rights, which is a very interesting part of EU law. So we're going to finish this very technical chapter tomorrow and speak of the fundamental rights of the rights of citizenship and other issues Okay.
Professor, can I ask the question, please?
Okay, bye-bye, everybody, also you online.
Can I ask
See you
the
tomorrow.
question?
Bye. Bye-bye. Okay, I leave the connection open because otherwise, yeah, it's bad.